My name is Katherine Rowan. I was 37 years old when I walked into the house I shared with my husband and watched him and both of my parents go pale. I should not have been able to surprise them. For 52 days, other people had controlled nearly every part of my life. They had decided when I slept, when I ate, when I stood, and how far I was allowed to walk. A therapist had taught me how to place my cane before moving my right leg. Another had taught me to pause when words disappeared halfway between my thoughts and my mouth. My left arm still ached where surgeons had repaired the fracture. 3 ribs pulled whenever I breathed too deeply. Sunlight could turn into a headache within minutes. But that afternoon, I was standing outside my own front door. Sophia Reyes had driven me from the rehabilitation center. She waited in her car at the curb because I had asked her to. She had offered to come inside, but I needed to know whether I could cross that threshold without someone taking the choice away from me. The brass key shook between my fingers. 52 days earlier, I had learned that my grandfather, Theodore Rowan, had left me an estate worth $60 million. That same afternoon, a car crash put me in intensive care. I spent 12 days unconscious and 35 consecutive days in the ICU. My husband, Julian, lived less than 20 minutes from the hospital. My parents, Victor and Elaine, lived less than 30. Not one of them came to see me. There had been no hospital restriction. They knew where I was. Julian spoke to my doctors by telephone, and my parents received updates through him. Still, the visitor chair beside my bed remained empty every day I was there. Now all 3 of them were inside my house. I knew because the security history showed that their access codes had been used repeatedly while I was hospitalized. I did not yet know what they had been doing. I had come home for medication, identification, and records from my office. I also wanted to see what condition they had left the place in. According to the plan Julian believed was still in effect, I was supposed to be entering a residential neurological program that day. He expected me to remain there for at least 12 more weeks. Instead, I slid my key into the lock. The door opened without resistance. At first, the house looked almost familiar. The narrow entry table still held the ceramic bowl where I used to leave my keys. Our wedding photograph still hung beside the stairs. Then I noticed a man's leather document case on the floor and a black stamp pad on the table. Voices came from the dining room. My father was speaking in the firm, impatient tone he used whenever he wanted a decision to sound final. My mother interrupted him in a lower voice. Julian said something I could not make out, followed by the rustle of several pages being straightened. I tightened my hand around the cane and moved forward. The dining room had become a private office. Documents covered the table. Some carried my full name. Others showed the address of my grandfather's property. Figures had been arranged in columns beside names I recognized, but my vision blurred before I could read the smaller print. A woman I had never met sat at the far end with a notary journal open in front of her. My mother's coat hung over one chair. 2 pieces of my father's luggage stood against the wall. Boxes from my home office had been stacked near the windows as if their contents belonged to everyone in the room. In the center of the table sat my grandfather's cedar document box. The lock had been forced open. Julian saw me first. His face emptied of color so quickly that, for one irrational second, I thought he might faint. "Kate?" My mother turned toward the doorway. Her hand rose to her throat. My father pushed back from the table, but he did not come toward me. He stared at the cane, then at my face, as though he could not make those 2 things belong to the woman standing in front of him. "What are you doing here?" he asked. It was not the question a father asked after failing to visit his critically injured daughter for more than a month. Julian recovered first. "You're supposed to be at the transfer center." The notary looked from him to me. No one asked whether I was in pain. No one asked how I had managed the steps or whether I needed to sit down. My mother took one small step toward the papers instead, placing herself between me and the nearest stack. That movement told me more than any explanation could have. I had spent weeks giving them excuses. I had blamed fear, work, exhaustion, and the discomfort some people felt around hospitals. Standing in that doorway, I understood that while I had been waiting for them beside an empty chair, they had been using their time somewhere else, and whatever they had planned depended on me remaining out of sight. They were not supposed to see me that day. Before I take you back to the morning this began, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and like this video. It helps stories like mine reach people who understand that the truth often appears in the choices others assume no one will witness. To understand why 3 members of my family were gathered around my documents while I was still learning to walk, we have to go back 52 days. My grandfather had been dead for 17 of them. Theodore Rowan was 84 when his heart finally failed. He had spent most of his adult life building Rowan water systems from a small parts supplier into a company that manufactured treatment equipment for municipalities across the Midwest. Most people described him as reserved. That was accurate, but incomplete. He rarely expressed affection through speeches. He expressed it through trust. When I was a child, he let me count inventory in the company warehouse. When I was old enough to understand invoices, he showed me how one incorrect number could travel through an entire business if everyone assumed someone else had checked it. As an adult, I met him for breakfast once a week. In his later years, I helped organize medical appointments, review household expenses, and keep track of the maintenance on his Delaware County property. I did those things because he was my grandfather, not because I expected payment. He had given me a worn brass key to his house years earlier. I always called before using it. That detail mattered more than I understood at the time. My father's relationship with him had been strained for most of my life. Victor had worked for Rowan Water Systems when I was young, but every conversation about why he left ended with my father blaming Theodore's pride and my grandfather refusing to discuss it. My mother treated the distance between them as a problem I could eventually solve. Elaine believed every family conflict required a person willing to absorb the discomfort for everyone else. That person was usually me. I had carried messages between my father and grandfather, corrected tax paperwork for my parents, and handled financial problems they described as temporary. They called me dependable. For years, I heard that word as affection. Julian knew that history. We had been married for 9 years, and he had watched me step into one family crisis after another. He used to tell me that my calm was the reason people trusted me. I trusted him too. 5 years before the crash, after a routine surgery, I had signed a durable financial power of attorney naming Julian to manage bills and ordinary accounts if I could not act for myself. It was an emergency document created during a stable marriage. I never imagined it could become important at the exact moment my family learned I was wealthy. 17 days after my grandfather died, I went to the Columbus office of Celeste Park, the attorney who had handled his estate planning for years. I expected an explanation of the charitable gifts he had discussed and instructions about the house. I believed he had probably left most of his remaining wealth to water infrastructure programs. Celeste closed the conference room door and placed a thin folder in front of me. She explained that my grandfather had arranged most of his securities and the proceeds from selling his company interest inside an independently administered trust for my sole benefit. His brick house and 12 acres outside Delaware would pass directly to me. A separate cash reserve would be distributed after the estate completed its administrative work. My parents had not been given an ownership interest in any of it. I asked Celeste whether she was describing a few $1,000,000. She held my gaze before answering. The net value of what your grandfather left you is $60 million. I looked down at the folder because the room had become strangely difficult to focus on. $60 million did not sound like an amount that belonged to an individual person. It sounded like a municipal budget, or the value of a company reported in the business section. It certainly did not sound like something my grandfather would place in my hands without warning. That can't be right, I said. Celeste did not react as though I had challenged her arithmetic. I've reviewed the figures with the executor and the corporate trustee. It is right. She explained that the number represented the net estate after debts, taxes, administration reserves, and charitable gifts. Most of the value came from securities and the proceeds of my grandfather's company sale. Those assets would fund the protective trust she had just described. The house and its 12 acres would pass to me separately, along with part of the cash reserve after the estate finished its work. Why me? Your grandfather believed you understood the difference between owning something and being responsible for it. That answer sounded like Theodore. It also made the inheritance feel heavier. I asked again about my parents. Celeste repeated that Victor and Elaine had no ownership interest in the estate. She did not insult them or imply that I should fear them. She simply told me not to sign, pledge, or distribute anything until I had read the full documents and understood the tax and legal consequences. I promised I would not. At that point, I still believed caution meant moving slowly enough to protect everyone's feelings. My father had taught me to keep my first ledger when I was 12. He owned a small maintenance company by then, and one Saturday, he sat me at his desk with a stack of vendor invoices. I found 2 duplicate charges before lunch. He was proud of me until I started noticing numbers he did not want questioned. As I grew older, he brought me tax notices and insurance disputes, but became angry whenever I asked for complete records. My mother usually called afterward to explain that he was embarrassed and needed patience. "You know how your father is," she would say. That sentence relieved him of the need to change and assigned the work to me. By adulthood, I had become the person who remembered policy renewal dates, challenged incorrect bills, and found the missing receipt before anyone else knew it was missing. My work suited the role. As Director of Forensic Accounting and Internal Investigations for Mid-Ohio Health Network, I was paid to locate the truth inside records people considered too complicated to examine. At home, I often used the same skill to make problems disappear before they created consequences. My parents called me dependable. Julian called me steady. We had met 11 years earlier during an audit connected to a hospital redevelopment project. He was leading a presentation for one of the contractors and answered a question about a delayed permit without looking at his notes. I admired his comfort with uncertainty. He said he admired the fact that I could make a room slow down by asking one precise question. 2 years later, we married. Our differences once felt complementary. I paid bills early and maintained reserves. Julian built Ross Urban Development around projects that took years to become profitable. When one of his closings moved or a tenant backed out, I covered more of our predictable expenses, and he promised the imbalance was temporary. I did not resent supporting the household. I earned a stable income and had owned the Worthington house before our marriage. Julian contributed when his projects paid, helped renovate the kitchen, and turned an unused bedroom into the office where I sometimes worked from home. What I wanted was honesty. Both of us had watched money destabilize our families in different ways. Julian's father had gone through a public bankruptcy when Julian was a teenager. He told me that experience was why he would never hide a serious financial problem from me. I believed him. There had been real reasons to believe him. When I accepted the position at Mid-Ohio Health Network, the new role required longer hours and difficult investigations. Julian cooked dinner on nights when I could not leave the office. When his first redevelopment project nearly failed because a lender changed terms, I sat with him at our kitchen table and helped separate a survivable delay from a true insolvency problem. We renovated the Worthington house room by room. He stripped old paint from the banister while I learned to install cabinet hardware. On our 9th anniversary, only months before the crash, we stood in the kitchen we had rebuilt and talked about how different our lives looked from the unstable homes we had known when we were younger. Those memories were not false. That made what followed more painful, not less. The imbalance had developed slowly. Julian's company grew, but each larger project required another guarantee, another temporary advance, or another month when I carried the household. Whenever I asked for a complete view of the business, he showed me the project that was closest to success. I accepted fragments because I trusted the person selecting them. My grandfather was less easily persuaded. Theodore respected Julian's energy, but asked questions he could not answer with optimism. Their conversations about development often ended with Julian calling him excessively cautious, and Theodore calling debt a promise that did not care about confidence. I interpreted the tension as a difference between generations. I did not know either man was keeping something from me. 5 years before the crash, I needed a routine operation. As part of the planning, Celeste's office helped me execute a durable financial power of attorney. It allowed Julian to pay bills, manage ordinary accounts, and maintain the house if I could not act. It prohibited him from giving my assets to himself or anyone in my family. At the time, signing it felt like an ordinary expression of marriage. When I left Celeste's office after the estate meeting, I called Julian first. He went silent when I told him the amount. 60? Net, according to Celeste. And it's available now? No, most of it is in a trust and the estate still has work to do. He recovered quickly and said we should take time before making any decisions. Then he asked who controlled the trust, when distributions could begin, and whether the house had passed directly to me. The questions sounded practical. Julian asked practical questions whenever a deal was complicated. I told him I did not have all the answers yet. We'll go through it together, he said. I wanted to hear partnership in that promise, so I did. My parents learned before I reached home. My mother called and said Celeste had sent them a formal notice explaining that they were not beneficiaries. She did not congratulate me or ask how I felt. Your father is devastated, she said. Whatever issues he had with Theodore, he was still his only son. I didn't write the estate plan. No one said you did, but you understand why this feels like a rejection. I did understand. That was the problem. Understanding other people's pain had always made me feel responsible for removing it. I asked whether they were all right financially. Elaine said they had a few temporary pressures from a property renovation, but nothing I needed to worry about during the estate process. My father came onto the call long enough to say the company wealth had been built on years of his labor. He called the trust a technical arrangement and said Theodore had always preferred paperwork to family. Dad, I haven't even read it yet. Then don't let an attorney tell you what your grandfather wanted more than your own family can. I told him I would call after I had time to think. Before ending the call, my mother returned to the line. You won't make any decisions before we all sit down, will you? I told her I had already promised Celeste I would not move anything quickly. I mean, as a family. That distinction should have concerned me. Instead, I reassured her that no one was being abandoned. The truth was that I had no plan for the money. I had not imagined a different house, a luxury car, or the end of my career. I was grieving the person who had accumulated it and wondering why he had trusted me with a responsibility he had never discussed directly. My first instinct was not to spend. It was to prevent the inheritance from hurting anyone. The rain had strengthened while I sat in Celeste's office. By the time I left downtown Columbus, water was running along the curb and traffic moved below the speed limit. I remember turning on the defroster. I remember the windshield wipers struggling to clear the glass. I remember thinking that I needed to call my parents again before the evening ended because my mother would interpret silence as punishment. Then there is a gap. The police report later filled in what my memory could not. An oncoming delivery driver entered a stretch of standing water too fast. His van lost traction, crossed the center line, and struck the front driver's side of my car. The driver survived. Investigators found no mechanical sabotage and no connection between him and anyone in my family. He was cited for unsafe speed. My crash was an accident. What happened afterward was not. Paramedics removed me from the car and transported me to a level 1 trauma hospital in central Columbus. I had a moderate diffuse axonal brain injury, a left temporal contusion, 3 broken ribs, a shattered left radius, and severe ligament damage in my right knee. Surgeons repaired my arm. A ventilator breathed for me. Julian was notified as my husband, medical contact, and financial agent. The hospital gave him instructions for visiting and speaking with my doctors. There was a chair beside my ICU bed. For the first 12 days, I was unconscious and could not know whether anyone used it. When I finally opened my eyes, it was empty. My first memories of the hospital were not complete scenes. They were pieces, a ceiling light that seemed painfully bright, a machine inflating around my legs, someone asking me to squeeze 2 fingers with my right hand, the taste of plastic and the sensation that my chest had been packed with broken glass. For several days, I could not hold on to time long enough to understand it. I would wake believing it was morning and learn that night had passed. A nurse would tell me the date, and within an hour, I would need to ask again. The records later showed what my mind could not keep. I had been unconscious and intubated for 12 days. After the ventilator was removed, aspiration pneumonia complicated my recovery. Episodes of autonomic instability caused dangerous changes in my heart rate and blood pressure. The brain injury affected my language speed, balance, and short-term memory. Even sitting upright required help. On what I later learned was ICU day 13, I became aware of the visitor chair. It sat to the right of my bed, close enough that someone could have reached my hand without standing. A folded blanket lay across the back. I asked a nurse whether Julian had gone to get coffee. She paused before answering, "Your husband hasn't been in today." I assumed that meant he had visited on another day. My speech was slow and questions exhausted me. I asked whether my parents knew where I was. The nurse confirmed that Julian had been receiving updates and that the contact information in my chart was current. That seemed like enough explanation at the time. Perhaps they had all sat beside me while I was unconscious. Perhaps the doctors had asked them to wait until I could tolerate stimulation. Perhaps Julian was handling the house, my employer, and the aftermath of the crash. I had always been good at constructing reasonable explanations for people I loved. Julian called that evening. His voice broke when he heard mine, and for a few seconds I heard genuine fear. "Kate, thank God." I tried to ask why he was not there. The sentence came out unevenly. "I've been managing everything," he said. "The house, insurance, your leave, the estate. The doctor said you need calm." No doctor had told me I could not have a quiet visitor. I did not have enough energy to challenge him. He asked whether I remembered my phone password. I told him my phone had been in the car. He said it was destroyed and that replacing it was not urgent while I was in intensive care. Then he asked whether I remembered signing the power of attorney. I did. "I'm paying everything," he said. "You don't need to worry." At that stage, worrying was one of the few things my body could still do without assistance. My mother called the following day through the nurse's station. She said she had developed a cough and did not want to expose me. My father, she explained, could not tolerate hospitals after watching his own mother die. "We're helping Julian get the house ready," she said. "That's what you need from us right now." I wanted to believe her. "When?" I asked. "As soon as it's safe." She did not define safe. 3 days later, she still had not come. Neither had my father. Julian called almost every day, but the calls became shorter. He wanted authorization to speak with the estate office. He asked where I kept an original copy of the power of attorney and whether there were other keys to my grandfather's house. When I asked him to visit, he said a lender problem had become urgent and that he was coordinating repairs at home. "I need you here," I said. There was a pause. "I am here, Kate, just not physically." Even with an injured brain, I understood the difference. My parents sent no flowers. Julian said the ICU discouraged unnecessary items. That was technically true. It did not explain why none of them arrived carrying only themselves. The staff began to notice before I was willing to name it. One nurse lowered the window shade when the afternoon glare became painful and asked whether there was anyone else I wanted contacted. I tried to remember Sophia's number and could not. My phone had stored it for years. Without the device, the familiar digits had vanished. I felt ashamed of that failure, as though my inability to summon a telephone number explained why I was alone. The nurse reminded me that memory problems were symptoms, not moral defects. She offered to ask Julian for my contacts. He told the unit he would handle it. No list arrived. At night, The hospital became quieter, but never silent. Monitors sounded in nearby rooms. Wheels passed in the hallway. I listened for footsteps that might stop at my door. When they did, they belonged to staff. I began studying the faces of people who entered. Respiratory therapists, nurses, residents, and aides introduced themselves, performed their work, and left. Their reliability should have comforted me. Instead, it made the family absence sharper because strangers kept every promise they made about returning. I began asking the nurses what day it was every morning, and then I counted. Day 18, day 21, day 24. The chair stayed empty. I started asking staff to move it closer to the wall because looking at it made concentration harder. Then I asked them to move it back. If Julian came, I did not want him to think there was nowhere to sit. That contradiction occupied more of my mind than it should have. I wanted evidence that no one was coming and remained afraid of doing anything that might cause them not to come. One afternoon, an aide changed the blanket on the chair. I asked why when no one had used it. "We change everything," she said. She meant hospital linens. I heard something larger and began crying before I understood why. The aide did not tell me to be strong. She brought tissues, lowered the light, and remained until my breathing slowed. She was in the room for 7 minutes. I knew because the clock was directly in front of me. I had reached the point where 7 unrequired minutes from a stranger felt like proof that I was worth staying for. When Julian called later, I almost told him. Instead, I asked whether he would come the next day. "I'll try," he said. The next day, I watched the clock from the end of morning rounds until evening medications. He did not arrive. On day 25, a therapist helped me take 3 steps beside the bed. My right knee shook, and my left arm could not bear weight through a walker, so 2 people guarded me while a third moved the equipment. Afterward, I slept for nearly 4 hours. Julian called while I was waking and asked whether the doctors thought I could understand complex materials. "What materials?" "Nothing urgent. I'm trying to plan ahead." I asked him again to come. He said he had a meeting with lenders the next morning and had spent the afternoon dealing with insurance. Then he added that seeing me connected to machines would make it difficult for him to remain strong enough to manage everything. For a moment, I felt guilty for asking. That reflex frightened me more than his excuse. I was the person with the injured brain, broken bones, and failing sense of time. Yet I was still measuring my needs against his comfort. My body improved in small, humiliating increments. The first-time therapist helped me stand, my right knee buckled, and 2 people lowered me back to the bed. Light from the window could trigger a headache so severe that I vomited. I sometimes knew exactly what I wanted to say and could not retrieve an ordinary word. During one call, Julian asked whether I could sign my name. "Why?" "There may be forms for the estate and your rehabilitation placement." I told him I was not signing anything without reading it and speaking to Celeste. His response was gentle. "Of course, I'm only trying to protect you." It was the first time that word made me uneasy. I asked a social worker whether anyone had been prohibited from visiting me. She checked the notes and said no restriction had been placed on my family. The unit required badges and limited visitor numbers, but 1 person could have come during approved hours. I asked if Julian had ever received a badge. She could not answer casually from memory, but she said the hospital maintained a visitor record. The answer did not arrive immediately. The question remained with me. On day 27, my father called for less than 4 minutes. He said he was relieved that I was making progress. Then he told me the family needed to avoid emotional decisions about Theodore's estate until I was thinking clearly. "I haven't made any decisions." "Good. Julian understands that everything has to stay stable." The word everything sounded larger than my treatment. I asked whether he had been inside my house. "We've been helping." "With what?" "The things you can't handle right now." He ended the call after saying I should focus on recovery. My mother called 2 days later and spoke as if we had already agreed that their absence was sensible. She said my father was overwhelmed by Theodore's death, Julian was under terrible pressure, and I had professionals caring for me around the clock. "You're the strongest person I know," she said. Before the crash, I would have accepted that as praise. From a hospital bed, it sounded like permission to leave me alone. I asked whether she could come for 10 minutes and sit without talking. She told me she would discuss it with my father. The following day, she said his blood pressure was high and that leaving him alone would be irresponsible. I did not point out that Julian was also absent or that she could have visited while my father remained home. I was still treating each excuse as a separate problem. I had not yet allowed myself to see them as a system. By then, I could remember enough to recognize the pattern. When my parents needed something, urgency erased every obstacle. When I needed something, every obstacle became proof that I should understand. The pneumonia began to resolve. My blood pressure stabilized. I could sit in a chair with supervision, eat modified food, and complete short conversations without losing every thread. None of that meant I was healed. It meant I no longer required the highest level of critical care. On ICU day 35, a case manager explained that I would transfer the following morning to inpatient neurological rehabilitation. I asked again about visitors. This time, she brought the record. There were calls from Julian. There were clinician notes documenting information given to him. There were no family visitor badges connected to my room. Not one visit in 35 days. I stared at the list until the numbers blurred. The next morning, hospital day 36, an ambulance transported me 12 minutes to the rehabilitation center. The empty chair did not come with me. The question it created did. Rehabilitation measured progress in tasks that had once been automatic. Standing from a chair without pulling on another person. Reading a paragraph and recalling its first sentence. Moving my left hand without allowing pain to change the motion. Walking 10 feet while placing the cane correctly before each step. Dr. Amara Shah led the team. During our first meeting, she did not ask whether I felt normal. She asked what I could do safely, what I understood, and what mattered to me. I want to go home, I said. Then we'll determine what home requires. The daily schedule exhausted me. Physical therapy focused on transfers, balance, and my damaged knee. Occupational therapy taught me to dress without twisting my healing arm and to prepare simple food without losing track of a hot surface. Speech therapy tested attention, memory, and the ability to organize several steps in order. One exercise required me to study a mock utility bill and identify an error. I found it quickly, then needed 10 minutes in a dark room because concentrating triggered a headache. That contradiction defined my recovery. I could understand a complex problem and still be unable to tolerate the effort for long. I could make a sound decision while needing help to tie a shoe. Anyone who wanted control could point to the help and pretend the judgment did not exist. It was the first answer I had received that treated my preference as part of the medical plan. My difficulty speaking quickly did not mean I had lost the ability to understand. Fatigue made my processing slower. Light and noise could overwhelm me. I needed information in smaller pieces and time to consider it. I still knew what an asset was. I knew who my family members were. I understood that a decision could be legal, financial, and emotional at the same time. Once I could use the facility phone without losing track of the numbers, I called Sophia. She answered on the second ring. Kate? Hearing my name in her voice almost ended my ability to speak. I asked whether she knew about the crash. Julian told me it was minor. He said you needed quiet and would call when you were home. I was in intensive care for 35 days. The silence that followed was different from Julian's silences. It contained shock rather than calculation. Which rehabilitation center? She asked. She arrived that afternoon. Sophia and I had met at university. She became an occupational therapist while I moved into forensic accounting. Our friendship had survived career changes, my marriage, and several periods when I let family crises consume all my attention. She came carrying a small bag with unscented lotion, a soft sleep mask, and a notebook. She asked before taking the chair beside me. The question stopped me. For 35 days, I had wanted someone in that chair so badly that permission seemed absurd. Yet Sophia waited for my answer. When I nodded, she sat where I could see her, without turning my injured neck. She did not touch me until I reached out first. She did not photograph the room, contact my family, or begin solving things I had not asked her to solve. Every small choice returned a piece of control so ordinary that I had not known it was missing. After half an hour, a therapist arrived for my scheduled session. I expected Sophia to promise she would come back and disappear into the uncertainty where every other promise had gone. "What time should I return?" she asked the therapist. 4 would be safest. At 4, Sophia was in the hallway. Reliability did not arrive as a grand declaration. It arrived at the time it said it would. "What do you need?" I began to say I was fine. The word would not come out. Instead, I cried. Sophia did not tell me to stop. She did not ask about the inheritance. She did not say that my parents or Julian must have a reason. She waited until I could breathe evenly and then helped me list 3 immediate problems. I had no phone, I did not know what was happening at home, and I did not understand who controlled my discharge information. "We can take one at a time," she said. I apologized for calling her only when I needed something. "You called because you needed me. That is what a phone is for." There was no ledger underneath the offer, no reminder of what she had done for me before, no expectation that access to my life would expand because she had shown up. I did not know how unfamiliar that kind of help had become until I received it. The next day, Julian joined a care conference by telephone. Dr. Shaw explained my progress and the types of assistance I would need. Julian said the Worthington house could not safely accommodate me. He claimed the stairs were unavoidable, no reliable caregiver was available, and his work required frequent travel. None of that was entirely true. The house had a main floor guest room and bathroom. Paid assistance was financially possible even before the inheritance. Sophia had already offered temporary space in her accessible guest suite while a home plan was arranged. Julian did not mention those options. He supported transferring me to a residential neurobehavioral program for at least 12 more weeks. "I haven't agreed to that," I said. "You're not ready to understand how much support you need." Dr. Shaw interrupted before I could force my thoughts into a faster response. "Physical support needs and decision-making capacity are separate questions." Julian's tone changed slightly. "I'm her husband. I know how she functions." For 9 years, that statement would have reassured me. In the conference room, it felt like a claim of ownership. After the call, Dr. Shaw asked what I understood about the proposed facility. I explained that it would provide more supervision, but also delay my return to ordinary decision-making. I knew I might need it if the team found behavioral or safety problems that could not be managed elsewhere. I also knew no one had identified those problems. "Wanting to leave is not evidence that you are ready," she said. "But disagreeing with your husband is not evidence that you are incapable." She ordered a home accessibility review using the actual layout rather than Julian's description. The report confirmed that a temporary main floor arrangement was feasible with equipment, scheduled assistance, and outpatient care. Julian continued to insist that paid support would be unreliable. He did not explain why an institution he selected was trustworthy, while professionals I selected were not. That evening, Sophia helped me access the security account connected to my house. The app had not been installed on the facility tablet, but the records were backed up online under my private credentials. The access history covered the weeks I had been hospitalized. Julian's code appeared repeatedly. That was not surprising. It was also my marital home. My father's code appeared 21 times. My mother's appeared 17. Several entries lasted late into the evening, on days when my parents told me they were too ill, too overwhelmed, or too uncomfortable to visit the hospital. Their codes opened my front door. The house was less than 30 minutes from my ICU. I felt the old urge to find an explanation. Maybe they were cleaning. Maybe they were collecting clothing. Maybe they were making the main floor accessible, despite what Julian had said. Then I saw an alert from the office printer account. Multiple jobs had been sent while I was unconscious. The metadata did not show the full contents, but several file names included my surname, the word legacy, and references to property schedules. I asked Sophia to close the screen. My headache had sharpened, and the room seemed to tilt. "Do you want me to call someone?" she asked. I told her to call Celeste Park. Celeste visited the next morning. She brought no estate papers into the room until she had spoken with Dr. Shaw and confirmed that I could choose whether to meet. I told her about Julian's questions, the proposed residential transfer and the access logs. "Can he take the inheritance under the power of attorney?" "No," she said. The directness of the answer steadied me. She explained the structure in plain language. My grandfather's net estate was $60 million. $55.3 million would fund the Katherine Rowan Legacy Trust. Commonwealth Fiduciary Services, an independent corporate trustee, controlled the principal under the trust terms. Julian could not amend the trust, change its beneficiary, assign my interest, pledge it as collateral, or compel a distribution. Neither could my parents. Theodore's house, valued at $3.4 million, would pass directly to me. A $1.3 million cash reserve would follow after administration. Those assets also belonged to me separately, but they required ordinary protection against unauthorized documents and commingling. Then why is Julian asking about my signature? I don't know yet. Celeste did know something she was not willing to act on casually. She told me my old power of attorney remained effective until I revoked it. It allowed Julian to pay genuine expenses and manage ordinary accounts during incapacity. It expressly prohibited gifts to himself, gifts to my relatives, and transfers into entities he controlled. Can I revoke it now? If you understand the nature and consequence of that decision, yes. But given your injury and the likelihood that Julian will challenge you, I want the capacity record to be independent and clear. She was not refusing to help. She was protecting the decision from becoming another family argument without evidence. I asked whether she had heard from Julian. Celeste said he had requested general information about expected distributions and had identified himself as my financial agent. Her office had provided nothing beyond notices he was legally entitled to receive. Commonwealth Fiduciary had also declined to discuss directing trust funds without authority under the trust instrument. Did he ask about my condition? Celeste chose her answer carefully. He asked when you might be able to execute documents. The headache arrived before the emotion did. Sophia dimmed the lights. Celeste closed the folder. No one told me the answer proved more than it did, but no one tried to soften it into concern either. Dr. Shaw arranged a decision-specific assessment. A separate neuropsychologist would conduct another. They would not ask whether I could walk alone or speak as quickly as I had before the crash. They would determine whether I understood my assets, the authority I had given Julian, the choices available, and the consequences of ending that authority. The preparation was not coaching, Doctor. Shaw asked staff to give me information in accessible form and document when fatigue affected performance. Celeste explained the power of attorney again, including what would happen if I revoked it. Julian would lose authority over my separate accounts. Banks would need notice, and I would need another arrangement for bills I could not manage personally. I understood that revocation would not make every past transaction disappear. It would only stop lawful reliance on the document going forward and allow suspicious activity to be examined. I also understood the personal consequence. Ending Julian's authority without telling him first would change our marriage, even if the records later showed nothing improper. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask why protecting my own accounts felt like a betrayal, while his refusal to sit beside me did not seem to require explanation from him. That night, I barely slept. Part of me feared failing the evaluations. Another part feared passing them and learning that my suspicions were correct. For most of my life, I had responded to family pressure by explaining more, fixing more, and waiting for everyone to calm down. This time, I made a different decision. If the doctors confirmed that my judgment belonged to me, Julian's authority would end. The first evaluation took place on my 12th day in rehabilitation. The neuropsychologist did not ask whether I liked Julian or trusted my parents. She asked me to explain the authority I had granted, identify the assets that authority could reach, and describe what would happen if I revoked it. I told her Julian could manage ordinary accounts and household matters under the power of attorney, but he could not give my property to himself or my relatives. I explained that the inheritance trust was governed by a separate instrument and an independent trustee. She gave me alternatives and asked me to compare them. I could leave Julian's authority in place, restrict it if the document allowed, revoke it and appoint someone else, or revoke it without immediately naming another agent. Each choice had practical costs. I chose revocation without replacing him. I could arrange bill payment through secure professional services while I recovered. I did not want to transfer intimate financial authority to Sophia simply because she had behaved decently during a crisis. Trustworthy help did not need to become ownership. The evaluation lasted less than an hour, but I slept through most of the afternoon. Dr. Shaw completed her own decision-specific assessment 2 days later. She asked some of the same questions in a different order. I lost one word, corrected myself, and requested a break when the headache became severe. None of those things changed the result. Both evaluators found that I understood the decision and its consequences. My body was damaged. My judgment still belonged to me. Celeste returned with a formal revocation. I read every page, then signed in front of the required witnesses. Her office sent notice to Julian, my banks, the estate, and Commonwealth fiduciary services. The financial institutions flagged recent activity and blocked new reliance on the old document while records were reviewed. I also changed who could receive information about my treatment. Julian remained my husband, but he no longer had permission to control my discharge details once the team recognized my capacity. The change did not feel triumphant. It felt like stepping onto a surface I had not tested. Julian called that evening. Why did I receive a revocation notice from Celeste? Because I revoked the power of attorney. You made a major legal decision without speaking to me. You've made decisions about my accounts and where I'm supposed to live without coming to see me. He exhaled slowly. This is exactly why I'm worried. You're drawing extreme conclusions while you're still recovering. Then come here and say that to me. He did not. The next morning, he sent a message asking me to reconsider before the banks overreacted. He said revocation could damage projects, alarm lenders, and create costs our marriage would eventually have to absorb. The plural pronouns did work, the facts could not. His guarantees became our exposure. His company became our shared future. My authority became a marital asset. I asked him to identify one consequence of revocation that concerned my treatment, housing, or daily care. He did not answer that question. He sent photographs of the Worthington house instead, the narrow stair, the lip at the shower, the rugs someone had rolled against a wall. He wrote that Sophia was filling my head with suspicion and that Celeste was exploiting my fear. The photographs were useful. They showed someone had already moved furniture and measured the rooms. They also showed my mother's purse on the kitchen counter beneath that day's newspaper. I forwarded the images to Celeste without commentary. By then, I was learning that every answer did not need to happen in the same conversation. I could preserve evidence without persuading its author. I could postpone a family argument without postponing a legal protection. I could love the person I thought Julian had been and still protect myself from the person using my accounts. That separation felt unnatural. For years, my method had been to solve the practical problem first and wait for everyone's emotions to settle. In the hospital, waiting had become one of the tools used against me. So I began treating the future separately from the unanswered past. Instead, he warned that the house was unsafe, Sophia was not qualified to supervise me, and Celeste had an interest in isolating me from my family. I asked what interest Celeste would gain. He had no answer beyond control. After the call, my hands shook so badly that I could not hold a cup. A nurse helped me drink water and reminded me that stress could worsen neurological symptoms without invalidating the decision that caused the stress. The rehabilitation team approved a safe plan for hospital day 52. I would leave inpatient care with a cane, medication supervision, outpatient therapies, and scheduled home health assistance. I would stay temporarily in Sophia's main floor guest suite while the Worthington house was assessed and secured. At my request, the discharge time and destination remained private. Julian knew only the plan he had supported earlier. He continued telling my parents that I would transfer to the residential program for at least 12 weeks. I learned that later from their messages, but at the time I only knew he expected me to remain somewhere he could describe as necessary. On the morning of day 52, Sophia brought loose clothing that fit over my brace and shoes with soles my physical therapist had approved. Dr. Shaw reviewed the warning signs that required emergency care. I signed the discharge papers myself. Walking from the wheelchair to Sophia's car consumed more energy than I wanted anyone to see. "We can go straight to my place," she said. I looked at the small bag containing 2 weeks of medication and the temporary identification the hospital had helped me obtain. "I need my passport, the original insurance folder, and the files from my desk. I need to see the house." Sophia did not tell me it was a good idea. She asked what would make it safer. We agreed she would remain at the curb unless I called or failed to return within 15 minutes. My attorney knew where I was going. I would not argue about property, try to remove large boxes, or stay if my symptoms increased. The drive through Worthington felt both familiar and unreal. I recognized every intersection, but my body reacted to each turn as though movement itself were a threat. By the time we reached my street, I had pressed my palm against the dashboard twice to steady myself. The journey ended at the front door I have already described. The next thing I had not yet seen was the heading on the document closest to her hand. Rowan Legacy Holdings, LLC. Below it, Julian was identified as manager. Victor and Elaine Rowan were listed as minority members. I moved closer to the table. "Don't," Julian said. It was the first direct command he had given me in my own house. I stopped because my balance required it, not because he had authority. The notary closed her journal halfway. "Mr. Ross told me he was signing as attorney-in-fact," she said. "That authority was revoked." Julian's jaw tightened. "We dispute whether she had capacity to do that." The notary looked at me again. I stated my full name, confirmed I owned the house, and told her I did not consent to Julian signing anything for me. She shut the journal completely. "Then I'm not notarizing a signature today." My father pushed one set of pages beneath another. "This is a planning meeting, Katherine. No one has taken anything from your inheritance." That was not the same as saying no one intended to. I began reading what I could from where I stood. The operating agreement was only the first document. A proposed assignment directed future inherited distributions into the LLC. A private credit application sought $9 million using anticipated trust distributions and my grandfather's property as support. A draft post-nuptial agreement would have converted part of my separate inheritance into shared marital property if I signed it. Beside those pages lay an internal allocation schedule. Julian's name appeared next to $7.8 million. My parents appeared next to $3 million. The remaining column was labeled for my care and taxes. They had divided money they did not control, using a distribution the trust had never promised to make. Elaine stepped toward me with both hands open. "It looks terrible because you're seeing drafts without context." "What context makes this mine?" I pointed toward the LLC. "And that money yours? Your father's business is under pressure. Julian's projects employ people. We were trying to keep the family stable until you could participate. You didn't come to the hospital." Her expression changed. "You had medical care. We were doing the practical work." Victor struck the table with 2 fingers. "That money came from a company I helped build. Theodore used paperwork to cut me out, and now lawyers are telling you that makes it morally right." Grandpa left it to me. "Because he wanted to punish me. My father had looked at $60 million and found only evidence about himself." Julian tried a different approach. "The trust won't release money without a structured purpose. This company would have given us a vehicle to manage investments and cover your care. With you as manager. Because you're not in a position to run it. I looked at the draft post-nuptial agreement. When was I supposed to sign that? No one answered immediately. Then I saw a short strategy document partly covered by the allocation schedule. The visible lines referred to presenting the plan in stages, limiting technical detail, and approaching me after therapy when cognitive fatigue was greatest. Something inside me went quiet. They had not simply assumed I would agree. They had planned around when resisting would be hardest. The page divided the proposal into steps. First, present the limited liability company as an administrative convenience. Second, request only the assignment of available estate interests. Third, describe the $9 million credit application as a reserve rather than a borrowing. The post-nuptial agreement came last. After the document predicted I would be tired of conflict and eager to leave supervised care. Beside one line, someone had written, "Small approvals build comfort." I recognized my mother's handwriting. Julian said the notes were brainstorming, not instructions. Elaine said she might have copied language he dictated. Victor said every responsible family plans for incapacity. Each explanation tried to reduce the same page to someone else's idea. The notary opened her journal again and asked Julian whether he had known of the revocation before she arrived. He said he had received an electronic notice, but believed it was invalid because of my neurological condition. She asked whether he had disclosed that dispute when scheduling the appointment. He did not answer. "I will not notarize any signature under this authority," she said. That refusal mattered. She did not need to decide who loved me, whether my marriage could be saved, or which version of my childhood was true. One professional saw contested authority and stopped. The simplicity of it made my family's choices look even more deliberate. Celeste had already explained enough for me to understand that their assignment could not reach the trust, and the proposed lender could not turn an expectation into valid collateral. The plan was not powerful because it had succeeded. It was powerful because it revealed what they intended to do with my vulnerability. I asked the notary for her card. Julian objected, but she gave it to me. I used my phone. Sophia had arranged a temporary replacement that morning to photograph the documents visible on the table. My hands trembled, and several images blurred. I took them again. My father moved toward the papers. I lifted the phone. "If you remove anything, I'll tell my attorney exactly what was here and who witnessed it." "You're threatening your own parents," Elaine said. "I'm documenting my own house." The distinction cost me more energy than it should have. The room tilted. A bright line formed across the edge of my vision, one of the warnings Dr. Shaw had described. My right knee began to shake. Julian reached for my arm. I stepped back. That movement hurt, but I did not let him touch me. I called Sophia. She entered less than a minute later and stopped near the doorway, waiting for me to tell her what I needed. "Medication folder," I said. "Passport, the blue insurance file." Nothing else. We retrieved those items from the first floor. I did not try to carry the cedar box or seize every page. The notary had witnessed the meeting. The images were already backed up. Celeste knew where I was. As Sophia helped me toward the door, my mother followed. "Kate, if you walk out now, you're turning a misunderstanding into a legal war." I wanted to explain one more time. I wanted to make her admit that a mother should have visited before organizing her daughter's money. Instead, I looked at the coat she had left over the dining chair. She had made herself at home in the house she claimed was too unsafe for me. "I'm leaving because I'm not safe enough to stay." My father said my full name in the tone that had ended arguments when I was 12. "Katherine Rowan, you will not humiliate this family." For most of my life, disrespect had meant making an older person uncomfortable. It had never meant entering an unconscious daughter's house, taking her money, or arranging her signature around her fatigue. I kept moving. Outside, I barely reached the car before my knee gave way. Sophia lowered me into the passenger seat and waited until I had taken the medication the team prescribed for severe headaches. Through the window, I saw Julian standing inside the open doorway. He no longer looked shocked. He looked angry that I had arrived before the plan was ready. I slept for 14 hours at Sophia's house. When I woke, the documents were still real. That mattered because part of me had already started searching for a softer interpretation. Brain injury had made me distrust my own endurance. Family conditioning had taught me to distrust my judgment whenever it created consequences for someone else. The photographs prevented both forms of doubt from rewriting the table. Celeste came to Sophia's house with a divorce attorney and an independent forensic examiner. The attorney explained that marriage did not authorize Julian to manage my legal response. I needed separate representation. The examiner did not ask me to reconstruct transactions from memory. She asked which institutions held my accounts, which ones were joint, where I stored statements, and what activity would have been normal before the crash. Those were questions I could answer. My professional experience helped me identify what to preserve, but I did not conduct the investigation myself. I could work for 20 minutes before a headache forced me to stop. Other people issued requests, obtained records, and maintained the evidence trail. The first confirmed total arrived 3 days later. $418,000 had moved outside the inheritance trust after the crash. The largest transfer was $168,000 from the joint reserve account Julian and I used for taxes, home repairs, and emergencies. He moved it to Ross Urban Development. Because the account was joint, he had direct access. That did not make draining the reserve honest or exempt it from divorce review, but it separated the transaction from his agent authority. The remaining transfers came from assets titled to me. Using the power of attorney, Julian moved $136,000 from my brokerage account into a business escrow he controlled. He sent $90,000 to my father's maintenance company. He sent $24,000 to an account my mother used for household and tax arrears. For the transactions from my separate accounts, Julian had signed certifications stating that the money was being used solely for my maintenance and benefit. The statements were false. The signatures were not forged. Julian had signed his own name and written attorney in fact beneath it. That detail mattered because it removed the defense he kept offering in private, that everyone was reacting to sloppy paperwork. He had used a real legal mechanism, certified a false purpose, and directed my property toward obligations that belonged to him and my parents. The authority was genuine. The stated benefit was not. There were legitimate expenses too. He had paid the mortgage, utilities, insurance, and several medical bills. The examiner separated those payments rather than treating every act under the power of attorney as theft. That distinction strengthened the truth. Julian knew how to use the document properly. He chose when not to. That pattern was visible across dates and categories. He paid an insurance premium from the correct household account, then used my brokerage to satisfy his escrow shortage. He approved a pharmacy charge of $48 as maintenance, then certified $90,000 to my father under the same description. Confidence was not his defense. It was evidence that he understood the boundary. When my attorney sent a demand for records, Julian called me directly, despite instructions to communicate through counsel. "The company transfer was temporary," he said. "A closing would have replaced it before you were home. You told everyone I wouldn't be home for 12 weeks because that was the medical plan before Celeste interfered. Dr. Shaw approved my discharge. You're focusing on technical violations while everything I built is at risk." There it was again. My money was personal when he needed sympathy and technical when I needed consent. The records showed what he meant by risk. Julian had signed personal guarantees totaling $7.8 million across several development projects. Refinancing on the largest project had failed after my crash. Lenders could begin enforcement within 60 days. The amount beside his name on the family allocation schedule was not an estimate of what our future might require. It was the exact number he needed to save himself. The largest lender had set a deadline 8 days after my scheduled discharge to demonstrate additional liquidity. The $9 million application on my dining table would have covered the guarantees and produced a margin for fees. It had not been approved. No lender had accepted the inheritance trust as collateral, and Commonwealth Fiduciary had never consented. Julian sometimes spoke as though the failure of that application proved he had done nothing. It proved the safeguards had stopped one part of the plan. It did not make the attempt innocent or return the money already moved. My parents' situation was smaller but more immediate. A mixed-use renovation had stalled after cost overruns. Unpaid contractors, loan obligations, and tax arrears totaled $642,000. They had placed $3 million beside their names because they did not only want to clear the debt. My father intended to stabilize his company and recover the status he believed Theodore had taken from him. Emails between my parents made the extra amount explicit. My mother called it a family investment that would let Victor stand level with Theodore at last. My father asked whether distributions could be structured without a fixed repayment date. Neither message discussed my rehabilitation, the cost of home care, or what I might want to preserve. For days, I kept translating their request into the smallest sympathetic version: a frightened husband protecting employees, aging parents trying not to lose a business. Compassion made their fear understandable. It did not convert my property into their emergency fund. When I confronted them through a controlled meeting arranged by counsel, Victor did not deny receiving the $90,000. "It went to employees and vendors," he said, "not into my pocket. It came out of my account while I was unconscious." Julian said he had authority. "Did you ask whether giving it to you benefited me?" My father leaned back. "Keeping your family solvent benefits you." My mother said the $24,000 prevented tax enforcement and kept their household functioning. She insisted Julian presented both transfers as advances that would be documented later. "Then why didn't you tell me? You were critically ill. You could have told me while sitting beside me." Elaine began to cry, but her answer did not change. Theodore's cedar box provided the next part of the history. My attorney obtained an order preserving the contents after the photographs established it had been opened. Celeste identified the records Theodore had maintained, and the estate supplied copies from corresponding files. 9 months before my grandfather died, Julian had asked him privately for an $8 million bridge loan. The request described the same development exposure later hidden from me. Theodore refused. He wrote that the proposal depended on optimistic valuations, incomplete disclosure, and the assumption that future money could repair present risk. Julian never told me he had asked. He did tell my father. Messages between them began shortly after the refusal. Julian complained that Theodore trusted my judgment while treating both men as irresponsible. Victor replied with years of grievance about the company and predicted Theodore would use his estate to humiliate him. Their alliance had not begun in my hospital room. The crash gave it an opportunity. The archive also contained records from 22 years earlier when Theodore removed my father from company leadership. Victor had used company credit to cover personal losses and delayed reporting it. Theodore allowed him to leave without public prosecution, but he never restored financial authority. For my entire childhood, I had heard that story described as a conflict between two proud men. The records gave it another name: consequence. Theodore was not flawless. His notes showed that he worried about Julian and my father, yet he never told me about the loan request. He built safeguards and left explanations in a box instead of having a conversation that might have prepared me. I loved him. I was angry with him. Both feelings were true. One memorandum in Theodore's archive explained why he had selected independent trust administration. He wrote that affection distorted judgment most efficiently when money arrived during grief. An outside trustee, he believed, would give me time before anyone else's emergency became my command. On paper, he had protected me with remarkable precision. In life, he had left me unprotected from the shock of discovering why that precision was necessary. Evidence could validate my judgment without repairing what secrecy had cost. The financial evidence explained motive, but the hardest record was not a bank statement. It was the timeline. The hospital provided badge data and clinician call notes. Julian had received updates from the first night. He knew when I was unconscious, when the ventilator was removed, when pneumonia complicated my recovery, and when I began speaking. There was no instruction prohibiting him from visiting. Messages showed that he forwarded updates to my parents. Elaine asked whether I would remember the first weeks. Victor asked how long the estate could operate without my signature. On ICU day 18, when my mother said her cough made visiting unsafe, her code opened my house at 10:12 in the morning. She remained there for almost 6 hours. On day 25, when Julian said a lender meeting kept him from me, he entered the house with my father. The cloud printer recorded 3 jobs containing drafts of the family holding company. On day 29, when my father's blood pressure supposedly required my mother to remain with him, both of their codes were used within 2 minutes of each other. They spent the evening in my home. The visitor log remained empty. The smart lock log did not. We verified time zones, device identifiers, and individual access codes before relying on any entry. The doorbell camera had retained only fragments, but 2 clips showed my parents and Julian carrying file boxes into the house on dates they said they were unavailable to visit. A printer service log connected the drafts to Julian's laptop. None of the records contained a confession. They did not need one. Neutral systems had recorded what affection kept asking me to excuse. The notary's appointment record showed Julian had described me as unable to participate and expected to remain in institutional treatment. The rehabilitation communication file showed he had claimed the house could not support me, no caregiver was available, and extended placement was medically necessary. The home accessibility assessment contradicted him. Sophia's immediate visit after a single phone call contradicted him. His own messages contradicted him most clearly. In one thread about obtaining future signatures, he told my parents I was improving quickly and would soon be able to understand a staged proposal. In a later legal response, he described me as too impaired to revoke his authority. He adjusted my capacity according to what he wanted me to do. I arranged the dates in a spreadsheet because that was still how my mind found order. At the top were hospital days. Beside them were clinician updates, house entries, print jobs, calls, and transfers. For a long time, I stared at the space where a family visit should have appeared. There was no missing record. There had been no visit. My relatives had spent 35 days making choices about my money, my house, and my future. Every one of them had known where my body was. Not one had chosen the chair. I closed the spreadsheet and began crying before I could turn away from Sophia. I kept thinking I hadn't explained how scared I was, I said. She sat beside me but did not touch me until I reached for her hand. They knew you were there, she said. That was all. It was also the answer. The empty chair was no longer a question I had failed to solve. It was information. I closed the spreadsheet and did not open it for 3 days. In therapy, I admitted that part of me still wanted an explanation large enough to restore the people I had lost. I missed the husband who brought coffee to my desk during quarterly audits. I missed the mother who sat awake when I had pneumonia at 16. I missed the father whose hand had steadied the back of my bicycle. Those memories were not fabricated just because later choices were cruel. That was what made the betrayal difficult. The people in the records were not strangers wearing familiar faces. They were people who had once made me feel safe and then decided my unconsciousness was permission. I did not have to erase the good to name the harm. Once the records made denial difficult, my family changed the subject from what they had done to whether I was competent to object. Julian's attorney filed a response claiming the brain injury impaired my judgment, that Celeste had influenced me, and that every financial decision had been intended to preserve family stability until I recovered. The filing did not say the transfers had benefited me directly. It argued that helping Julian's company and my parents ultimately protected my emotional and financial environment. By that reasoning, anything they wanted could become care if they used my name in the explanation. Julian also claimed my unexpected return home showed impulsivity. My attorney answered with the discharge plan, the 2 capacity evaluations, the paid care arrangements, Sophia's accessible guest suite, and the fact that I left the house when symptoms increased. Dr. Shah provided contemporaneous records rather than a dramatic opinion written for litigation. Her notes showed that I understood my choices, requested breaks appropriately, and distinguished physical limitations from financial judgment. The neuropsychologist's assessment reached the same conclusion independently. Julian's own messages did the rest. When he wanted me to sign a post-nuptial agreement, I was improving quickly. When I revoked his authority, I was too impaired to understand anything. Both claims could not be true on the same dates. My parents did not file their own capacity challenge. Elaine chose a less formal route. She called relatives, former neighbors, and people who knew me through Theodore. She said the crash had changed my personality. According to her version, I had become suspicious, hostile, and vulnerable to attorneys who wanted control of the estate. Several people contacted me to say they were worried. One asked whether I remembered how devoted my parents had always been. Another said my mother was losing weight from stress and that no amount of money was worth destroying a family. Elaine also wrote to one of my colleagues. She asked whether brain injuries commonly caused paranoia and whether my employer had noticed uncharacteristic accusations. That message created a practical threat. My work required clients and regulators to trust my judgment. With my permission, Dr. Shah supplied a narrow letter confirming that I had completed decision-specific capacity evaluations and that my treatment team supported a gradual return to professional activity. My attorney told Elaine to stop contacting my workplace. I did not disclose my full medical chart to earn the right to be believed. I corrected the false factual claim and kept the rest private. I did not release the bank records online. I did not post photographs of the dining room table or send the visitor log to everyone in Columbus. My attorney corrected false statements only where they affected the legal process, the estate, or my employment. Silence did not mean agreement. It meant I refused to turn my medical recovery into public entertainment for the people who had already treated it as an opportunity. The first court orders were temporary and narrow. Julian could not dispose of marital records or claim new authority over my accounts. The Worthington house, which remained titled to me, was protected from transfer while access and possession were addressed. Financial institutions preserved the questioned transactions. Commonwealth Fiduciary formally confirmed that the $55.3 million trust had not been penetrated. No assignment, pledge, or distribution to my family had occurred. The estate kept the $1.3 million cash reserve in administration until secure separate accounts were established. My grandfather's house also remained separate property. The $60 million was not sitting in Julian's bank account waiting for a dramatic reversal. The safeguards had worked. What remained was the harm outside them. The locks and alarm codes at the Worthington house were replaced under a temporary access agreement. Julian received one supervised period to collect clothes, business records, and personal items. I stayed at Sophia's while an inventory professional documented what left. Every household expense after separation was logged. Every request went through counsel. It looked cold compared with the casual access of a marriage, but casual access had hidden the damage. Structure did not destroy a healthy relationship. It showed me which relationships had depended on the absence of limits. Julian requested a private conversation. My attorney arranged a controlled meeting with counsel present. He looked exhausted. For the first time since the crash, the confidence that usually surrounded him seemed smaller than the room. "I was going to replace the money," he said. "You don't know that. I knew the projects. One closing would have covered every transfer. And if it didn't," he looked down, "the trust gave us options. It gave me options." His expression hardened at the word me. "We were married, Kate. You're talking as if I was a stranger stealing from you. A stranger would not have had my power of attorney." He said he had been terrified when the hospital called. I believed him. He said seeing me unconscious would have made him useless, so he focused on the things he knew how to control. That could explain the first day. It did not explain 35. "You asked when I could sign before you asked when you could sit beside me. That isn't fair. It's in the call notes. Records had become unfair only when they stopped supporting his version of himself. Julian asked whether I had ever loved him. Yes, I said. The answer seemed to disorient him more than anger would have. He said he had made one desperate decision while believing he could repair it before I knew. Then he described planning the company, coordinating with my parents, moving 4 accounts, and challenging my capacity as though each act were part of the same instant. It stopped being one decision every time you had another chance to tell the truth, I said. He admitted that after the first transfer, he thought the only safe direction was forward, safe for the projects, safe for his reputation, safe from my refusal, not safe for me. My parents asked for a meeting next. Victor began by saying Julian had misled them about the scope of his authority. Elaine said she never read the technical documents and believed everything was temporary. The messages showed that both knew the funds came from my accounts. They might not have understood every trust restriction, but they understood I had not approved a transfer while conscious. Your father's company would have closed, my mother said. People would have lost work. Then you should have asked me after I recovered. There wasn't time. There was time to spend 6 hours in my house. She flinched. My father did not. You have $60 million and you're forcing us to sell things over $114,000. The combined parental transfers had become one number in the civil demand, $90,000 to his company and $24,000 to the account my mother used. The amount I have does not change how you got it. It changes the consequence, he said. You won't even feel the loss. That sentence exposed the belief underneath everything else. If taking from me did not reduce my comfort enough for them to notice, they did not consider it harm. My parents' attorney proposed structured repayment. They could return part immediately, sell a recreational lake parcel they had purchased years earlier, and repay the remainder over several months. Their primary home was not part of the proposal. The lake property had no residence on it, only a small dock, a storage shed, and recreational acreage. Selling it would disappoint my father. It would not displace either parent or eliminate their basic security. Elaine continued describing the proposal to relatives as though I were evicting them from their home. Precision mattered most when guilt depended on blur. My mother described the lake parcel as the only place my father relaxed. She asked me to accept a smaller amount so he would not lose it. For several hours after the meeting, I considered doing exactly that. The old response arrived automatically. I calculated what they could afford, what I could absorb, and how quickly everyone might calm down if I accepted responsibility for the difference. Then a headache forced me to stop working. My vision narrowed, and nausea sent me to the floor beside Sophia's bathroom before I could reach the sink. She sat outside the door while I recovered. She did not tell me what decision to make. I realized I was using my limited strength to design a softer consequence for people who had used my medical crisis to avoid asking permission. The next morning, I instructed my attorney to proceed with full restitution. My parents called the decision vindictive. Victor left a voicemail saying Theodore had trained me to use money as punishment. Elaine sent an apology that began with regret and ended with a request that I keep the matter private, withdraw the civil demand, and help refinance the remaining company debt. An apology conditioned on relieving the consequence was another proposal. I declined it. I did not feel vindictive. I felt sick, tired, and guilty. That was when I learned a boundary did not have to feel powerful in order to be real. The repayment agreement was signed. New account protections were established. Access to the Worthington house was restricted while the divorce and civil matters continued. The first installment arrived 2 weeks later. I felt no satisfaction. I pictured my father selling the parcel where he had taught me to cast a fishing line, and then I pictured the vendors whose invoices his company had left unpaid. Consequence was not pleasure. It was the return of cost to the decision that created it. I reminded myself that the payment did not create a new injury. It repaired part of an old one. For the first time in my adult life, my family faced a financial problem without assigning the unpaid portion to me. I could not rescue them and leave the system unchanged, so I stopped. For the first several months, legal progress arrived in envelopes I was too tired to open. My days were still organized around outpatient therapy. Physical therapy taught my right knee to trust stairs again. Occupational therapy worked on grip, coordination, and the small left-hand tremor that appeared when I was tired. In cognitive rehabilitation, I practiced switching between tasks without losing the first one. A supermarket could exhaust me faster than a deposition summary. Migraines came without respecting the calendar. On good mornings, I could read for 2 hours, make lunch, and walk half a mile. On bad afternoons, light beneath a closed door felt sharp enough to touch. The cases moved anyway. Lawyers exchanged discovery while I counted steps in a clinic corridor. Banks answered subpoenas while I practiced fastening buttons. Lenders reviewed Julian's guarantees while a speech therapist timed how long I could follow a dense paragraph before the words blurred. At 5 months, Mid-Ohio Health Network offered me a limited advisory return. I began with 2 remote mornings each week. I did not lead interviews or supervise urgent field work. I reviewed plans, marked risk questions, and stopped when a timer told me to stop, even if I believed I could continue. The first report I completed took 3 times as long as it once would have. When my director thanked me for finding a contradiction that everyone else had missed, I went into Sophia's guest room and cried. It was not gratitude alone. I had feared that every useful part of my mind had been converted into evidence other people could debate. Work reminded me that my judgment could belong to something besides my defense. I eventually increased to 3 reduced days. I could have resigned. The trust made employment financially unnecessary, but the work still mattered to me, and choosing less of it was different from having it taken away. Meanwhile, ordinary diligence reached Ross Urban Development. Julian told me through counsel that hostile allegations had frightened his lenders. The documents told a more precise story. During renewal reviews, lenders found personal guarantees that had not been disclosed consistently across projects. Investors learned that short-term cash presented as business liquidity included $168,000 from our joint reserve and $136,000 transferred from my separate brokerage under agent authority. The temporary orders did not command anyone to abandon him. My attorneys did not contact his customers or buy any of the company's debt. I did not use inherited money to pressure a bank. I declined to rescue the company. That was enough for Julian to describe me as its destroyer. One project was sold under lender supervision. Another partner exercised a contractual right to remove Julian from management after the undisclosed guarantees came to light. The refinancing he had expected never closed. By the 9th month, he no longer controlled Ross Urban Development. The removal did not happen in a single public collapse. First, a construction account required 2 signatures. Then the chief financial officer began reporting directly to a lender representative. Finally, the remaining partners voted under a clause Julian had once described to me as protection against an irresponsible manager. He challenged the vote and lost. The guarantees remained his obligations even after the authority attached to his title was gone. Through counsel, he asked whether I would purchase one note at a discount. He said doing so could preserve value for both of us and prevent outsiders from profiting from a family disaster. I refused. Buying the debt might have produced a financial return. It also would have placed me back inside a system where his emergency set my priorities. I did not need to choose the least profitable option to prove I was not retaliating. I only needed the freedom to decline a transaction I did not want. The name remained on several signs until the projects changed hands. I passed one from the passenger seat on the way to therapy. For a moment, I remembered helping Julian choose the typeface at our kitchen island. He had cared about how the letters would look from traffic. I did not feel victorious seeing them covered. Employees found other positions. Investors absorbed losses. Projects continued under people who had not created the same leverage. Consequence spread farther than the person who caused it, as financial consequences often do. That fact deserved grief, but it did not make concealment a form of protection. Divorce discovery moved more slowly. The forensic examiner traced marital and separate property from before our wedding through the day of the crash. She did not treat every dollar Julian earned as mine or every mistake as fraud. She identified dates, titles, purposes, and the authority claimed for each transfer. The $168,000 from our joint reserve and the $136,000 from my brokerage produced a combined credit of $304,000 in the marital accounting. The court treated the movements to Julian's company and escrow as dissipation and breach, not as a good faith family expense. The Worthington house remained mine because it was separately titled and the temporary orders had preserved it. Theodore's residence, the trust, and the separate cash distribution were inherited assets. Julian received no share of them. There was no hearing where a judge announced that $60 million belonged to me while dramatic music played. There were schedules, stipulations, expert tracing, and pages of findings. The result mattered because it was specific. At mediation, Julian offered to accept a smaller cash settlement if I signed a statement saying he had acted to preserve marital assets. My attorney read the proposed sentence aloud. It would have converted motive into authorization and erased the false certifications without changing a single bank entry. I rejected it. We resolved furniture, vehicles, retirement contributions, and tax allocations without that language. Some items went to him because they were his. Some were sold. I paid amounts the tracing showed I properly owed and insisted on credits the same tracing proved were mine. Fairness did not require me to soften the record until everyone appeared equally wrong. What Julian had no lawful claim to did not become marital property merely because he had expected to use it. Once secure accounts were operating and the disputed access had been contained, the estate released the $1.3 million cash reserve. I placed it under the same written controls I used for other liquid funds. Its arrival did not feel like a prize. It felt like the last piece of Theodore's plan reaching me after passing through a fire. My parents' restitution finished before the criminal case did. Victor and Elaine sold the lake parcel. A family acquaintance purchased it after an ordinary listing, not a forced auction. The price covered the remaining settlement obligation after their first installments and costs. Their primary home was untouched. They returned the entire $114,000. My father reduced his company to a smaller maintenance operation. He sold equipment, ended the mixed-use renovation, and stopped employing several relatives who had been carried on inconsistent hours. My mother cut back spending and withdrew from 2 civic committees after questions spread through people who had seen the civil filings. Those consequences were real. They were not the same as prison, and the available evidence did not support pretending that my parents and Julian had committed identical acts. They had accepted money they knew I had not approved and participated in a plan to obtain more. Julian had also controlled the agent instrument and made the false written certifications that released my separate funds. Precision applied to responsibility as much as it applied to bank records. After the last restitution payment, Elaine mailed me a copy of the lake parcel's closing statement. No letter was enclosed. In the margin beside the net proceeds, she had written, "Paid in full." I kept the statement with the settlement records. Theodore had taken me to that parcel twice when I was a child. I remembered cattails along the shore and Victor laughing when a fish stole bait from my hook. The land was not guilty of anything. Its sale still carried a history that my spreadsheet could not display. For one evening, I wondered whether accepting less would have preserved one harmless place in our family. Then I understood that my parents had been free to sell another asset, change the repayment schedule before signing or refuse money they knew was unauthorized. The parcel had not been selected by me. It was the resource they chose when required to return what they had taken. Grieving that choice did not make it mine. I did not call. At 11 months, I moved from Sophia's guest suite into a short-term, accessible apartment. I wanted to test living alone before deciding what to do with either house. Sophia helped carry kitchen boxes and complained about my collection of cast iron pans. Then she went home. That last part was important. She did not become my new manager, permanent caregiver, or substitute family authority. She had an emergency key while I recovered, but she never asked to see an account statement. When I offered to reimburse the months of household costs she had absorbed, she accepted documented expenses and refused anything beyond them. "You don't owe me a percentage of surviving," she said. The sentence was so unlike the language surrounding my inheritance that I wrote it down. Living alone exposed what supervised recovery had hidden. I could shower, cook simple meals, and manage medication without help. I could also forget a pan on low heat if I tried to answer a work call at the same time. I installed an automatic shutoff and stopped pretending adaptation was surrender. I kept a cane in the hall closet for difficult days. Most mornings I walked without it inside. Fatigue still pulled my right foot when I overreached. My left hand trembled after long meetings. Improvement was measurable and incomplete. The criminal investigation focused on a narrower set of facts than the divorce. Prosecutors did not charge Julian for failing to visit me or for speaking cruelly. They did not prosecute a draft assignment that never reached the trust. They reviewed the 2 transfers from my separately titled assets, the agent certifications he signed, and the records showing where the money went. 14 months after the crash, Julian entered a negotiated plea to 1 felony count of financial exploitation. I attended remotely with my camera off. Dr. Shah had warned that the courthouse light, waiting, and noise could trigger a migraine, and I had stopped treating physical suffering as proof of seriousness. Julian admitted that he knowingly used his position as my financial agent to direct separate property for purposes that were not solely my maintenance and benefit. His attorney described the business pressure, his lack of prior convictions, and the restitution already secured through civil proceedings. The prosecutor described the false certifications, the amount, and my medical vulnerability. The judge imposed 3 years of supervised community control. A custodial term was suspended on the condition that Julian comply. He was ordered to complete full restitution and prohibited from serving as another person's financial agent during supervision. No one applauded. The judge asked Julian whether he understood that violating the conditions could activate the suspended term. He said yes. His voice sounded the same as it had when he promised my grandfather's watch would be safe in our house. That ordinary sameness unsettled me more than a transformation would have. After the hearing, my attorney asked whether I wanted to make a statement to reporters waiting outside the courthouse. I said no. The public record was sufficient. My pain did not become more legitimate when packaged for strangers. I requested a certified copy of the plea and sentencing entry. When it arrived, I read it once, verified the restitution language, and placed it in a file. For months, I had imagined consequence as a point beyond which I would stop rehearsing arguments in my head. The point arrived, and my mind continued. I still answered Julian while washing dishes. I still composed explanations for my parents in the dark. The difference was that no future protection depended on winning those imaginary conversations. That evening, I made soup, forgot the salt, and ate it anyway. A plea could settle a criminal count. It could not decide what to do with the coffee mug Julian had given me on our first anniversary, or remove his name from 10 years of memories. At 15 months, the divorce became final. The decree incorporated the financial credit, confirmed my separate property, and resolved the remaining household issues. Julian waived any claim to the trust, Theodore's house, and the inherited cash because the evidence gave him no viable claim. I retained the Worthington house and the right to sell it when I chose. I signed the final documents at a table in my attorney's office. My left hand shook once when I turned the page. I placed it flat until the movement stopped, then completed my signature, Kate Rowan. The name had never left me professionally. Seeing it alone on the decree still felt like a door closing on a room where some good things had happened. 2 days later, my parents requested one final meeting through their attorney. I declined the meeting but agreed to receive a written proposal. They said they wanted reconciliation. They also wanted assurance that I would not discuss the civil matter with extended family, that I would help Victor secure a smaller business line if an emergency arose, and that no contact would end immediately. They offered to attend counseling after those assurances were made. I responded with 3 conditions of my own. They had to accept responsibility without blaming Julian, Theodore, or my injury. They could not ask for money, credit support, or business assistance. They had to respect no contact unless and until I chose to change it. Victor called those conditions punishment. Elaine said a daughter who truly wanted healing would meet her parents halfway. There was no halfway point between permission and its absence. They refused. I instructed counsel to close the exchange. The old family structure ended without a ceremony. No judge declared that I had finally learned my lesson. No apology arrived with every condition removed. I felt relief, then grief for feeling relief, then anger that even my freedom seemed to require an audit. I had spent my life believing a family survived because one dependable person absorbed whatever the others could not carry. What survived that way was not the family, it was the demand. Formal protection did not feel like the end of danger at first. For weeks after the divorce, I still checked account alerts each time I woke during the night. A car slowing outside my apartment could tighten every muscle in my back. When a maintenance worker used the building's master key after knocking too softly, I sat on the kitchen floor with my heart racing long after he left. The accounts were secure. The court orders had done their work. The trust remained independently administered. Julian's authority was gone, and my parents had no access to my home, records, or schedule. My nervous system did not read orders. Therapy after betrayal was less orderly than financial tracing. There was no ledger where I could place the years of good marriage on one side and the dining room documents on the other. I could remember Julian sleeping upright beside me during a flu and still know he avoided my ICU room for 35 days. I could miss my mother's birthday call and still refuse to answer if she made it. Grief did not require me to restore access. Neither did money cure it. $60 million gave me extraordinary safety. It paid for expert care, protected time to recover, and allowed me to make decisions without fear of losing housing or insurance. Pretending otherwise would have been dishonest, but wealth could not make my left hand still. It could not restore 12 unconscious days, manufacture a hospital visit, or make a trusted signature innocent. Money changed the conditions around my recovery. It was not the recovery. I decided what to do with the Worthington house after the divorce was final. No creditor had taken it. Julian had not received it in settlement. I owned it, and I could have returned after the locks were changed. A security company had inspected every window and replaced the alarm panel. The rooms were safe by any technical measure. I walked through them once with Sophia and a real estate agent. The dining table was gone. Julian had taken it during the supervised property division because it had belonged to his parents. 4 pale rectangles remained on the floor where its legs had protected the wood from sunlight. In the kitchen, I remembered the first dinner we cooked after moving in. We burned garlic bread, opened all the windows, and ate pasta from the pot while snow came through the screens. Upstairs, the bedroom still held a faint mark where we had measured the height of a bookshelf. In the hall closet, I found one of his umbrellas behind my cane. The house contained a real marriage as well as its ending. That was why I could not turn it into a museum of betrayal or pretend it had always been hostile. It had been a home until people I trusted used their access to plan around my absence. I listed it for sale. My parents later told someone I had lost the house because of the divorce. I did not correct every rumor. The deed, the decree, and the closing statement all told the truth to anyone entitled to know it. The sale was my decision. On the morning the buyers took possession, I made one final circuit alone. I stood where the dining table had been and looked toward the front door. I did not reconstruct the moment I came home. I thanked the version of myself who had crossed that room injured, frightened, and unwilling to surrender her own name. Then I left the keys for the buyers. Theodore's house in Delaware County needed work before I could live there. It had been built when narrow doorways, steep thresholds, and polished floors were signs of craftsmanship rather than hazards. The downstairs bathroom could not accommodate a support rail. The laundry was in the basement. Tree roots had lifted part of the front walk. I hired an architect who specialized in accessible restoration. We widened 2 interior openings, added a main floor bedroom suite, and moved the laundry upstairs. We improved lighting without turning every room white. The front walk was relaid with a gradual approach, and a nearly invisible rail followed the steps. I kept Theodore's study. The desk was refinished but not replaced. His maps returned to the walls. We cleaned the brass front door hardware and repaired its internal mechanism instead of installing a different handle. A modern security sensor sat discreetly above the frame, but the worn brass key still turned the lock. The cedar archive box came back after the litigation hold ended. Its lid had been forced near the latch. A craftsperson repaired the split wood and reinforced the hinges. She offered to replace the broken lock with one that looked original. I told her to leave the lock broken. The papers inside no longer needed to live there. The estate records were digitized and stored with counsel. I placed only copies of Theodore's memorandum and a few family photographs in the box. A repaired box did not need to pretend it had never been opened. Neither did I. The restoration took months. I visited in short intervals, measuring progress against my endurance. Early on, I used the cane from the car to the front step. Later, I carried it folded in a bag. Some visits ended after 20 minutes because saw noise triggered a headache. Others lasted long enough for me to choose paint, approve shelves, and sit at Theodore's desk while afternoon light crossed the floor. I did not preserve the house exactly as he had left it. The dark guest room became a therapy and exercise room. The formal dining room became a library with a table large enough for grant reviews and ordinary dinners. I moved Theodore's heavy chair away from the fireplace because it blocked the safest path. Inheritance was not obedience to the dead. It was the freedom and responsibility to decide what continued. Commonwealth Fiduciary and I adopted a written investment policy before the move. It set diversification limits, spending rules, and a multi-year liquidity reserve so that no market decline, personal emergency, or persuasive relative could turn haste into policy. Major changes required documented review. No family business received special access. No expected distribution could be pledged by someone else. The structure was intentionally boring. After the year I had lived, boring felt luxurious. I also established a limited annual grant program for independent patient advocates who served adults with cognitive impairment. The grants funded bedside navigation, decision support training, and help for patients whose families or agents controlled access to information. An outside committee reviewed applications. I did not select beneficiaries based on whether their stories resembled mine. At the first meeting, one applicant described how a trained advocate helped a stroke patient communicate that she wanted her sister, not her adult son, to receive discharge information. The advocate had not decided for the patient. She had created enough time and quiet for the patient's own preference to be heard. That was what I wanted the money to protect. The grants were useful. They were not redemption. I could not donate my way into believing the crash had happened for a reason. Suffering did not become necessary because something decent followed it. I kept working 3 reduced days most weeks. Sometimes I advised on an investigation without ever meeting the subject. Sometimes I spent an entire morning helping younger examiners distinguish a troubling pattern from a conclusion the records did not support. My director stopped asking when I would return to my old schedule. "This is my schedule," I told her. She nodded and adjusted the staffing plan. That ordinary acceptance meant more than any speech about resilience. Sophia remained in my life without becoming responsible for it. When I moved into Theodore's house, she helped arrange books, criticized the position of the sofa, and brought a grocery bag containing exactly 1 saucepan because she did not trust my relationship with cast iron. I gave her an emergency access code. She wrote it on a card, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in her home safe. "I don't plan to use this," she said. That's why you have it. She had never accepted money beyond documented expenses. I did not give her a house, a salary, or a role in the trust. Turning gratitude into financial dependence would have changed the very thing I valued about her help. We remained two adults who could say yes and no to each other. Professional access worked differently. The cleaning service received a code that expired at the end of each visit. Contractors received time-limited credentials for a specific door. The security system logged each entry and sent me a simple notice. At first, I reviewed the log several times a day, then once at night, then only when a notice appeared. Safety slowly became something I used instead of something I performed. 18 months after the crash, I woke on a cool April morning with no hearing scheduled, no therapy appointment, and no document requiring my signature. I made coffee and carried it to the small terrace outside the library. My left hand trembled against the cup until I changed my grip. The headache behind my right eye was present but mild. I took the medication Dr. Shah had prescribed and waited for the edge to recede. There were still days when fatigue arrived before noon. Crowded rooms could overwhelm me. If I worked too long, names disappeared for a few frightening seconds and returned only after rest. Recovery had not delivered my former body back in perfect condition. It had given me a body I knew how to listen to. By late morning, I decided to walk. The neighborhood road curved past old trees and a field that had not yet turned fully green. I went without the cane. It remained inside the front closet, available without shame. I passed a woman planting herbs near her mailbox. She raised one dirt-covered glove, and I raised my hand in return. Two children coasted by on bicycles, arguing about whose turn it was to lead. A delivery van slowed for the bend before continuing toward the county road. My body noticed it. My pulse quickened, and my right knee tightened. I stopped beside a stone wall, named 5 things I could see, and waited. The van disappeared. The road became only a road again. I continued. The walk was not a challenge I announced or a milestone anyone recorded. I turned back when fatigue began to pull at my shoulders. By the time the house came into view, I was tired but steady. The front steps were warmer in the sun. The restored brass plate carried small scratches that polishing had not removed. I took Theodore's worn key from my pocket. For years, I had remembered it in his hand. He used to turn it once, push his shoulder against the swollen winter door, and call the house stubborn. When he gave me a copy for emergencies, he told me a key was permission, not possession. I had been too young to understand the difference. I turned the key. The lock released without resistance. I crossed the threshold on my own and closed the door enough to keep the spring air from lifting the papers on the entry table. The security panel showed the morning's record, my exit, no entry after it. Sophia's emergency credential remained unused. The cleaning code from the previous day had expired 6 minutes after the service left. Every person who could enter had been chosen. Every permission could end. I set the brass key on the table. My left hand trembled once against the wood, then I closed the front door gently.